Hello everybody, and welcome to my channel. Last time we dove into the second part of the American Civil War, where we covered the year of 1862 and the Emancipation Proclamation. Today we'll cover the year 1863 and photography. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. The war. In 1863, the first half of 1863 was grim for the Union cause. In the East, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia experienced its greatest successes. Meanwhile, Union armies in the West were stifled, especially in their efforts to take Vicksburg, Mississippi. Catastrophic Confederate losses in early July, however, left Lee unable to ever take the offensive again, gave the Union control of the Mississippi River from top to bottom, and divided the Confederacy in half. Nevertheless, problems plagued both sides as the war's toll weighed increasingly on the people at home. The war in the East. In the East, after both armies had spent the winter in camp, the arrival of the active 1863 campaign season was eagerly awaited, especially by Hooker. The massive Army of the Potomac numbered around 132,000, the largest army formed during the war, and was termed by Hooker the finest army on the planet. It was opposed by Lee with about 62,000 troops. Hooker decided to move most of his army up the Rappahannock Cross and come in upon the Confederate rear at Fredericksburg, while John Sedgwick's smaller force would press Lee in front. Chancellorsville. Beginning his turning movement on April 27, 1863, Hooker masterfully swung around toward the west of the Confederate Army. Thus far, he had outmaneuvered Lee, but Hooker was astonished on May 1st when the Confederate commander left a small part of his force in Fredericksburg and suddenly moved the bulk of his army directly against him. Fighting Joe lost his nerve and pulled back to Chancellorsville, Virginia. Lee followed up on May 2nd by splitting his army and sending Jackson on a brilliant flanking movement against Hooker's exposed right. While scouting the Federal forces that night, however, Jackson was accidentally shot by his own pickets and died of complications several days later. Lee resumed the attack on the morning of May 3rd and slowly pushed back Hooker, who was knocked insensible by Southern artillery fire but refused to surrender his command even temporarily. Lee then returned to Chancellorsville to resume the main engagement, but Hooker, though he had 37,000 fresh troops available, gave up the contest on May 5th and retreated across the river to his old position opposite Fredericksburg. The Federals suffered 17,278 casualties at Chancellorsville, while the Confederates lost 12,764. Gettysburg. While both armies were licking their wounds and reorganizing, Hooker, Lincoln, and Halleck debated Union strategy. They were thus engaged when Lee headed north again on June 5, 1863. Marching through Maryland into Pennsylvania, the Confederates reached Chambersburg and turned eastward. Confederate cavalryman J.E.B. Jeb Stuart set off on a questionable week-long ride around the Federal Army and was unable to join Lee's main army until the second day at Gettysburg. Attacking on July 1st from the west and north with 28,000 men, Confederate forces finally prevailed after 9 hours of desperate fighting against 18,000 Federal soldiers under John F. Reynolds. On the second day of battle, Meade's nearly 94,000 troops were ensconced in a strong fishhook-shaped defensive position, running northward from the Round Top Hills along Cemetery Ridge and then eastward around Culp's Hill. On the morning of the third day, Meade's right wing drove the Confederates from the lower slopes of Culp's Hill and checked Stuart's cavalry sweep to the east of Gettysburg in mid-afternoon. Then, in what has been called the greatest infantry charge in American history, Lee, against Longstreet's advice, hurled nearly 15,000 soldiers under the command of Generals George E. Pickett, J. Johnston Pettigrew, and Isaac R. Trimble against the center of Meade's lines on Cemetery Ridge, following a fearful and deafening artillery duel of 2 hours. Despite heroic efforts, only several hundred Southerners temporarily breached the low rock wall at the Federal center. The rest were shot down by Union cannoneers and riflemen, captured or thrown back, suffering casualties of almost 60%. To Lincoln's great consternation, Meade felt unable to counterattack, and Lee retreated into Virginia. The Confederates had lost 28,063 men at Gettysburg, and the Federals 23,049. After indecisive maneuvering and light actions in northern Virginia in the fall of 1863, the two armies went into winter quarters. The War in the West, Arkansas and Vicksburg. The surrender of Vicksburg was an important victory for the Union. It was one of several significant turning points in the war, but was not decisive on its own. Confederate troops continued to put up a considerable fight, defeating Union forces at Chickamauga Creek, Georgia, and imposing great suffering at Chattanooga before finally losing that city. In Arkansas, Federal troops under Frederick Steele moved upon the Confederates and defeated them at Prairie Grove, near Fayetteville, on December 7, 1862, a victory that paved the way for Steele's eventual capture of Little Rock the next September. More importantly, Grant, back in good graces following his undistinguished performance at Shiloh, was authorized to move against the Confederate Gibraltar of the West, Vicksburg, Mississippi. In the early months of 1863, in the so-called Bayou Expeditions, Grant was again frustrated in his efforts to get at Vicksburg from the north. Finally, Grant landed his army to the south at Bruinsburg, Mississippi, on April 30, 1863, and pressed northeastward. He won small but sharp actions at Port Gibson, Raymond, and Jackson, while the circumspect Confederate defender of Vicksburg, John C. Pemberton, was unable to link up with a smaller Southern force under Joseph E. Johnston near Jackson. Turning due westward toward the rear of Vicksburg's defenses, Grant overwhelmed Pemberton's army at Champion's Hill and the Big Black River and enveloped the town. During his 47-day siege, Grant eventually had an army of 71,000. Pemberton's command numbered 31,000, of whom 18,500 were effectives. The outnumbered and starving Confederates were forced to capitulate on July 4th. 5 days later, 6,000 rebels yielded to Nathaniel P. Banks at Port Hudson, Louisiana, to the south of Vicksburg, a loss that divided the Confederacy in half. Lincoln could say in relief, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." Chickamauga and Chattanooga. Meanwhile, 60,000 Federal soldiers under Rosecrans sought to move southeastward from central Tennessee against the important Confederate rail and industrial center of Chattanooga, then held by Bragg with some 43,000 troops. In a series of brilliantly conceived movements, Rosecrans maneuvered Bragg out of Chattanooga without having to fight a battle. Bragg was then bolstered by troops from Longstreet's Veteran Corps, sent swiftly by rail from Lee's army in Virginia. With this reinforcement, Bragg turned on Rosecrans and, in a vicious 2-day battle, September 19th to 20th, at Chickamauga Creek, just southeast of Chattanooga, gained one of the few Confederate victories in the West. Bragg lost 18,454 of his 66,326 men. Rosecrans, 16,170 out of 53,919 engaged. Rosecrans fell back into Chattanooga, where he was almost encircled by Bragg. Bragg was able to choke off supplies to the point that Union troops were starving, but the Southern success was short-lived. Instead of pressing the siege of Chattanooga, Bragg unwisely sent Longstreet off in a futile attempt to capture Knoxville, then being held by Burnside. When Rosecrans showed signs of disintegration, Lincoln replaced him with Grant, who was able to establish a supply line by late October and strengthened the hard-pressed Federal Army at Chattanooga by sending by rail the remnants of the Army of the Potomac's 11th and 12th Corps under Hooker's command. Outnumbering Bragg now 56,359 to 46,165, Grant attacked on November 23rd to 25th, capturing Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge, defeating Bragg's army and driving it southward toward Dalton, Georgia. Grant sustained 5,824 casualties at Chattanooga and Bragg 6,667. Confidence having been lost in Bragg by most of his top generals, Davis replaced him with Johnston. Both armies remained quiescent until the following spring. Photography. Photography had existed for about 20 years before the war broke out, but technological developments in the late 1850s allowed for the mass production of images. More than 1 million tintypes, which were printed on metal, and ambrotypes, which were printed on glass, would be made during the war. But the most dramatic development in the field of photography was an exhibit Matthew Brady mounted in October 1862. Featuring pictures of the aftermath of Antietam, the show attracted huge crowds to Brady's New York City studio and lines wrapped around the block. Americans had never seen photographs of such carnage before. Mr. Brady has done something to bring home to us the terrible reality and earnestness of war. If he has not brought bodies and laid them in our dooryards and along the streets, he has done something very like it, the New York Times reported. And there you have it, the third part of the American Civil War. Next time, we'll dive into the fourth and final part of the war, the years of 1864 to 1865. Feel free to leave a like, share, and subscribe for future videos.